welcome back from spring break, the ones of you who made it back. So the first thing I want to point out is that on Wednesday, that's in 2 days, the intermediate report is due, and I'll spend some talking about that. And then a week later, the homework is due on the frequent items and some streaming stuff. So that homework is posted. I posted at some point over break. It should be shorter than the other homeworks. So still, make time. So make sure you look it over before the last minute so you allocate enough time. But it shouldn't take nearly as long as the last two homeworks. At least that's my intention. So it'll be basically on the stuff covered in this this lecture is at the very top of the screen. We'll talk a little bit more about streaming today, actually. So I'll give you some more kind of insights into streaming. So I've gotten quite a few questions on what to do for the intermediate report. Let's see if I remember this. There we go. Let's see. So the intermediate report. So just to review what's up here. It should be at most 1 page for every student in the group. Please make it just one document. It shouldn't be three separate things. It should be what is the project doing as a whole. You can break down what each of you are doing in it. 3 pages is the upper bound on this. It doesn't need to be that long, but if you want to go up to 3 pages, you can if you have 3 people in the group. The basic goal is I kind of want to make sure you're working on the project the whole time, so you don't do it at the end. So that's partially the reason here. Also, I want to kind of allow you to see what you've done so far and get some feedback on what you need to do to finish it up. So I would say probably roughly a quarter of the projects will probably find out that what they were planning to do is not going to work. That's just usually how it happens. And so for those people, you should almost definitely figure out by this point. If you get to the intermediate report and you haven't figured out yet, then you haven't done enough. So you want to make sure you have pretty good chance that what you will plan to be doing will succeed. If you think you came up to something, the data was not what you thought it was, something like that, now's the time to say, here's what I'm planning to do, and this is a good chance for me to give you more feedback. Okay, and then probably another quarter of you will still be able to do generally what you had planned to do, but you'll have to change it a little bit. And you'll probably shift course a little bit. And again, hopefully I don't expect you necessarily to catch all those things here, but probably most of them. Okay, so I want you to kind of get the basic thing working. Maybe you looked at a small enough sample of your data that it wasn't too computationally burdensome, that you kind of know that what you're going to do will work, or if it's not going to work, try and assess that, and then they say, here's what I'd like to do, or give me some feedback. And so if you do have a pretty good idea of what you're going to do, well, most of the project proposals and data collection reports were pretty vague on the specific target of what you're going to do. I want in the final report you to try and make some assessment of how well the technique you did worked. Okay. This is always a hard problem to say, is it good or bad? These are like these sort of statistical tests and so forth. I don't need a formal statistical test to say it worked or it didn't work, but I want you to try and make some sort of assessment. And so I'm hoping you're able to kind of make a plan of how you will make that assessment, and I will provide you some feedback. So I want to know, what progress have you made towards the goal? Kind of. So if you've just done if you've just done the data collection at this point, you probably will lose. You're probably going to lose some of the points. Okay, you need to do something beyond the data collection. So by basic approaches, so what does this mean? So some of you are kind of going to take some approach from some very simple approach we talked about, then try and extend it a little bit. Then I want you to get the simple approach working. Or sometimes you're going to compare a few approaches. I want you to get at least one of them working, or maybe working on a smaller data set. Other views are kind of doing something more entirely new, and at this point I'm hoping that you've got part of this working, right? The basic infrastructure setup. And so I want to see what are you planning to do to kind of finalize this. And part of this is, how do you demonstrate this effectiveness? This will be running experiments. What experiments will you plan to run? Try and write these down. It doesn't have to be too specific, but the more specific, the more feedback I can give you of how to tweak that. Okay, so this is your chance to kind of get feedback from me before you have to do the final report, which will be like a lot more points. So if you do this well, you follow the basic recipe here, you're going to get all the 15 points, and it'll be critical for getting all the points on the final projects. So on the final part, if you fail to do something now, I may not be able to take off points now, but I will be able to on the final thing if it doesn't line up perfectly. So I don't mean to say I'll definitely be a hard grade or anything, but just a warning. This is a reason why I could take off points if you aren't prepared enough at this point, and then something goes wrong and something is catastrophic in the final report. If it convincingly looked good at this point, then I'll probably be more sympathetic than if you didn't have much to say. Okay, so any questions on here? I know there's a large variety of projects, and what I said may not fit everyone's. But okay, so that's due Wednesday in class at the start of class. All right, so let's quickly look back at the schedule. So the next few lectures are going to be kind of, so some of the lectures in this class are more like, here's a certain technique for analyzing data. And others are for kind of speeding up that technique. How do you do it efficiently? So this one will be one on how do you do this efficiently. The next two afterwards are going to kind of be more advanced techniques, some fairly recent development in actually ways you can analyze data that wasn't around, roughly a decade. So these will be kind of fun, they'll be kind of fun lectures. You may not think some of the things that we can do would even be possible if you haven't seen these things before. And then we'll get into, but this will be kind of some more advanced material, so I'll try and give it to you at a fairly high level. And then we'll talk about some noise in the data, and this is about how to deal with noise and make assessments. And so this will be useful in the evaluation part if you haven't already figured out how to do that. So those will also be some fun lectures, and then we'll finish up talking about some. We'll finish up by talking about graphs and stuff. So okay, so the topic of today is to do approximate PCA. And so by PCA, I really mean we really need to approximate the singular value decomposition of the matrix. So the PCA is after you've centered the data, then you want to run SVD on it. So we'll just focus on approximating this SVD here. And if you remember, the input the input to this problem is this matrix A, which is going to be n by d, where this is the number of columns, and this is, oh wait, so, I'm sorry, n is the number of rows, and d is the number of columns. And so often, so for the purpose of this, we'll think of n being usually much bigger than d. And I'll give some, this is not always the case, but not, you can still do these techniques, or you can transpose it and do them on the columns instead of the rows. And so, so at least one student has asked me about where they have a data set where this n is really huge. So n was, I forget what the number was, something like, so n was something like 10 million, and maybe d was something like 10,000. And so, or even if it's smaller than this, you can't fit this whole data in memory and just call MATLAB. You may not be able to fit the data set in memory to call MATLAB to run the SVD. If you were to run the SVD, the runtime is basically O of n times d squared. So the size, the space of it is O of n times d, so the number of rows times the number of columns, and the runtime is even larger than that. Right? So if it's hard to fit in memory, it's going to take even longer to run this, especially if you're going to have, and you need slightly more memory than just the data set to actually do the computation. You need a little bit extra memory. So it's really going to be a problem if you have a really large data set and you're trying to run this. So and this was the input, and the goal here was to create these three matrices, US and B transpose, such that this is equal to A. So this, remember, is a, so S is a diagonal matrix with the, and these values on the diagonal are called the singular values. This matrix V contains the columns of V, although we use V transpose here. The columns of V are the right singular vectors, and they tell you kind of the major modes of variation of your data. Okay, so I'm gonna, one thing, the last lecture was a little bit abstract, so let me try and give a really cool example of how you use this. And so, so this is a technique called eigenfaces. And I don't know how much this is actually used in computer vision anymore, but it was a really kind of cool idea. So the idea is that every data point is an image of someone's face. Okay? And so we drew this picture before. We drew this picture where we have these different coordinates, and we have all these we had all these data points, and so this is a set P, and this is one point that is in P, and P is in some, so there are n points, and so that was, each row is a point, each point is in this d-dimensional space. In this case, d is equal to 2, because that's all I can draw. Okay, so now, in this application, each of these points is also going to be one of these images. And so in that case, D is going to be the number of pixels in the image. Okay? So I don't know exactly how big these pixels are, right, how big these images are, but if the image is a bunch of these pixels, and so it may be something like 1,000 by 1,000. So then D in this case is going to be 1 million, right? So each of these pixels is going to be one coordinate, and it gives a value between, say, 0 and 256 or something like that. But it could be a continuous value. Right? So now instead of a two-dimensional space, I've got this 1 million dimensional space. Okay? And so maybe these images are slightly smaller, but if it was 1,000 by 1,000, it would be this big. If it's 100 by 100, then I have a 10,000 dimensional space. Okay? So now I want to find the way that I want to try and take up all these pictures of these spaces as input, the number of points is the number of pictures, and I want to kind of figure out what are the common variations among these spaces. And what you get is something that looks kind of like this, which is creepy. It looks like it's, you know, from one of these horror movies, right? So the top left picture here is kind of the most important singular value, the one with the most variation. And what it's kind of showing just one direction of this. So what's black and what's white. So I think what's black is not varying too much, and what's white is varying a lot. Okay? And so that means that whether the person had a lot of dark hair or they didn't have a lot of dark hair was kind of the major thing that changed the most pixels. All the faces in this data set are kind of centered the same. So they all have the nose and the eyes in about the same part. You see a little bit of variation around the eye, but mainly it's the hair color. That's the most variation. And then the second one in the top row still, it seems to be whether their head kind of extended to the top of the picture. Or maybe it had something to do with the lighting condition. Maybe the third one probably has something to do with whether kind of the lighting, or I guess that's to do with the shape around the eyes and the shape around the mouth. And then the fourth one here is whether there's kind of whether there's a dark lighting or a light, like some light lighting in the scene. Okay, and these are kind of capturing these major variations. And so each of these counts as a vector. Okay, so remember, each of these points lived in this d-dimensional space, and now I had, so let's assume, remember we assumed that this data was somehow centered. So then the first vector, the vector lives in a d-dimensional space. It can be represented by a point in this space, and moving towards that point or not tells me a type of variation. Okay, and so this first image tells me the direction that there's the most variation among the points, and the second image is orthogonal to the first and says the second most variation. Okay, and so then there are various things you can say about this. So one other interesting thing to look at is if you plot the singular values. So and this is the fraction of the total Frobenius norm of the matrix. So again, they're plotting this on this cumulative density plot. You can see as you add more singular values, you capture more and more of the squared Frobenius norm. It's kind of the sum of the square of all the components, or it's the sum of the square of all the singular values. As you get more and more of these, you're getting more and more of the mass. And they say that after about 100 of these singular values, you have almost all of the variation in the images captured. That may have been they only have 100 pictures in their data set. But instead of, what this means is that if instead of representing every point as this million-dimensional vector, what you need to do is you need to store some small number, maybe 100 of these million-dimensional vectors. Okay, and then for each data point, you can represent it as a 100-dimensional point in the space described by these vectors. So you now have compressed every point into just these variations. And you've actually, if instead of the first 100, I took the first, say I took the first 8, right, then they have a picture, they try and reconstruct, let's see, a face here. So here's kind of the final face down in the bottom right corner. And with one singular vector, they get something that looks like this. With 2, they get this. And eventually around 7 or 8, or somewhere around here, they start to see what the final face looks like. Right? So when you're even in an 8-dimensional space, you start to get, this is the representation in just the 8-dimensional space. And as you get more and more dimensions, you get closer to the final face. This is one where this is 1 and this is 8 and this is 16 singular vectors. So they go up by 8 at a time. You can see as you keep adding more and more, the variation is more subtle, the changes. Okay, so this is an example of how to use this PCA and how the singular vectors mean in something maybe a bit more tangible than these abstract data points. Okay. So, but if you're computing this on a really big data set, this may be too much to handle in MATLAB. Or if you want to keep adding on more data points one at a time, you're collecting a system, you're building a system where you keep taking snapshots as people kind of walk into an elevator or something like that. You want to keep adding data points on. How do you try and update your estimate of this PCA? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. How to improve on this n times d squared running time. Or if d is bigger than n, you can do this in n squared times d. We'll talk about the regime where n is much bigger than d. Okay, so I'll show one more picture, one cool thing they can do with this. They want to determine whether something is a face. So what they do is they'll take, say, the first 25 of these singular vectors, and they'll find the closest point in that space of the singular vectors. So that's this point maps to here. It looks kind of like the same face here. The distance is not great, but it's not too far. When you take something that's not a face, say it's a rat, then maybe this person looks kind of like a rat, but it definitely does not look like the first image. So this is not a face. It's a way of saying whether it fits your data set. So remember, these singular vectors are supposed to capture this data set in a few kind of components, right? So if you have a data point which is very far from this, it's saying it's what's known as its residual it's very far from its estimate on this space, right? So if we just use this one singular vector, it looks as this line, okay? It's hard to draw more than that. Then this residual is the distance here. The further this distance is, the further you are away from capturing this, right? And so those faces, the left two don't have too high of a residual, but you know, this Bart Simpson face or this rat or this car are pretty far from the images, right? So their residual is pretty high. So that's something else cool we can do. So there are other ways of doing classification, but this is something you can get out of PCA. Okay. All right. So how do you do this? So how do you do this efficiently? So what we don't want to do is we don't want to run the SVD on the full data set. So what if we kind of did it on a sample of the data set? So how accurate is that going to be? Okay, so there's a technique called, it's usually called column sampling, but we'll talk about sampling. They have n bigger than d, or they have d bigger than n, but we'll flip the coordinates, and we'll call this row sampling. Okay, and we're going to think of having this matrix matrix A, And so what we want to do is we want to get the singular vectors, which are going to be, so this distance is going to be d, and this one is going to be n. And so d is going to be a lot smaller than n, so we're going to want to somehow choose some subset of these rows. And so we're going to say, if we just chose a subset of these rows, let's call this set R. So this is R, and this is, so this is matrix R. This is still D, and this is still T. How good can we use this R to approximate the SED of A? Okay, so this is the basic idea. Okay, so it turns out. So I'll tell you in a minute or two how to do this efficiently in the stream. There's a technique called reservoir sampling, or even simpler things if you don't know. But if you just sample the rows uniformly, you're not going to actually do very well. You're not going to be able to get a very good reconstruction of power. Okay, so if you just sampled, just picked an arbitrary subset of some large subset of the rows, why is this not going to work very well? So let's say that your data set your data set is going to look like where I'll tell you ahead of time, the top singular vector looks kind of like this, and your data set looks, you have a lot of data points here, and then you have a handful of data points out here. Okay, so if you just sample uniformly, you're probably going to, if there are a lot more data points here, you're probably going to pick these. But then you're not going to know, really only these data points are important. They're the ones that are driving where the variation is. There's only a handful of, say, the extreme points. And maybe it's not so bad, maybe there are a few other points along here. But still you have a lot of basic data points and then some that are further out. If you just sample them purely uniformly, you're just going to capture the data set here. So what you want to do instead is you want to sample them proportional to their squared norm. Okay, so you want to sample, let's call this AI, with probability proportional to the norm of AI squared. And so remember when I just write norm, this usually means the 2 norm if I don't specify it, and that's just the Euclidean distance. And I'm squaring it, right? So I'm looking at the distance from the origin, right? So I can look at this distance and then I square it. And I sample proportional to that. Okay? And we're going to sample some t number of these rows, right? So we're going to sample t of these rows. Yeah?
If your data is more concentrated on the ends, right? Then if we are sampling based on the probability of the norms, then you are going to miss out the data which is close to the center.
Yeah, that's true, but those data points are not really telling you where to draw the singular vectors. These data points are kind of noise. These are the only data points that really tell you anything interesting. Right, so let's say you took pictures of faces, and for some reason this was some system which is very automatic, and let's say sometimes it took a lot of false positives when like if the lights are off in the room, right? So all the pixels are black. Occasionally it takes pictures when the lights are on, and then it sees a face. And when it sees a face, then it's one of these data points, but you have a lot of these false positives. Now you can still get the data out of here by kind of ignoring these data points here. They have very little variation. It's the ones that are varying from that which are interesting. So this is kind of a strange data set. This is kind of an adversarial example of why you want to pick the larger points more. This is similar to how we chose when we did the k-means plus algorithm for doing the clustering. We wanted to choose the points further away to be the kind of the guess of our other center. We just picked them uniformly. Well, we might get more duplicates of the similar points we already have. So we want to get points further away from what we know is the center. And so if we know the center, then we want to get points very far away from it, because those are going to be determining the variance, and that we want to capture with the principal components.
So is the center mean here? Mean of all the points?
Yeah. So one kind of hint thing you should do is you should kind of try and center all of the data. Now you can kind of do this afterwards, and it's going to be pretty close to if you did it beforehand, if you get a good approximation. So you can probably do it afterwards. But even if you don't do it afterwards, you're going to capture, within one extra dimension, you're still going to capture stuff. There are ways to do it beforehand. It's just a little, it's a little bit trickier. And it doesn't always make that big a difference. You can kind of center it while you're sampling the points, but this is kind of harder to do. Okay, so we're going to sample them proportional to their squared norm. And so most of the algorithms that describe this said we're going to do t independent samples. So that means that we can actually, if this one goes here, this one goes here, and so forth, you could actually have this one go here twice. So say something was really big, you may actually want to sample this twice. It's not clear that that's actually better to do. It's kind of tricky to analyze this algorithm. It's going to look kind of like the Chernoff bounds we've seen, but it's a lot messier to deal with, and this just makes the analysis simpler. If you have a way of sampling them without replacement, that would be typically that'd be a little bit better. Okay, so how do we sample these? How do we sample these from a stream? So the other thing is, if we just sample t independently, we can just worry about sampling one row from the stream and run t copies of this algorithm in parallel. So every time we run a row, we go through a for loop and we run each of these things, right? So the algorithm is going to look something like this. Okay, so for 1 to n, so this is for each row, and then for j equals 1 to t. So this is for each of the samplers. We're going to try to maintain one of the samplers. Okay, and so then we're going to be inside of these two for loops is what we need to do. So before we start this, we're going to, let's just, to simplify notation, I'll just worry about one of these samples, and I'll call this, so we'll actually start at 2, and we'll start by getting this row R, and we'll set this to A1. Okay, and we're also going to keep track of a value F, which is equal to start out, this is just going to be A1 squared. So this will be the total squared Frobenius norm. And this will be this one sample that we have. And we're going to look at a new row. And for each of these things, we're going to think about replacing this row with the new one. Okay? So we're going to say with probability, we're going to look at AI squared over f plus ai squared. In that case, we're going to set r equals to ai. So with this probability, we're going to replace it. Okay, so how do you do something with that probability? Well, you choose a random number between 0 and 1, and you multiply that through by f by this denominator, and then if it's less than this value, then this succeeds with this probability. If it's greater than this value, then this is not true. So this is an if statement with the random value. So we saw some similar things like this before, so then we've replaced this. Right? So this is all we have to do. And then to finish this for loop, we need to update plus equals. Okay, so this is all we need to do. So if you wanted to do this with t samples, you need to run t of these things independently. So you have t different rows you're keeping track of this. So this is a very simple algorithm to do. So the main advantage of this is that it's very simple. So now we have this matrix R. What can we say about this matrix R? It's going to be much smaller. Well, how big do we need to have T? So T needs to be roughly 1 over epsilon squared times K. Okay, so this doesn't make any sense because I haven't told you what epsilon and K are. But this is going to have a guarantee as follows, and I'll explain what this means. A minus the projection onto R of A for e epsilon squared is less than or equal to, this is less than or equal to A minus AK squared plus epsilon. Okay, so what does this mean? So what we're saying is this R is going to find a subspace similar to the subspace you would have done by the top K singular vectors, and we're projecting A onto it.